You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio.
Is on. And you're the prey. You
unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
In baseball, Jackie Robinson is universally touted as the first black major league player, which conveniently forgets Moses, Fleetwood, Walker, and other players of color who appeared on 19th century diamonds. Football deals with the messiness a different way. The sport employs the term modern era instead, so Kenny Washington is the first black player of the modern era. James Harris was the first black quarterback to start an NFL game in the modern era. Art Shell was the first black head coach of the modern era. The reason football has to append the qualifier to its historical racial milestones is because there was a man who was doing all those things back when the National Football League began. His name? Well, his name was Fritz Pollard.
You walk into this room at your own risk, because it leads to the future. Not a future that will be, but one that might be. This is not a new world. It is simply an extension of what began in the old one. It has patterned itself after every dictator who has ever planted the ripping imprint of a boot on the pages of history since the beginning of time. It has refinements, technological advances, and a more sophisticated approach to the destruction of human freedom. But like every one of the superstates that preceded it, it has one iron rule. Logic is an enemy and truth is a menace. Any state, any entity, any ideology that fails to recognize the worth, the dignity, the rights of man, that state is obsolete. A case to be filed under M for mankind in the Twilight Zone.
By thy rivers gently flowing, Illinois, Illinois. By thy prairies verdance growing, Illinois, Illinois. Comes an echo on the breeze, rustling through the leafy trees, and its mellow tones are these. Illinois, Illinois, and its mellow tones are these. Illinois.
Another sport now, football, which many people think is brutal today. Imagine the sport, though, 100 years ago. The rules were different. Few players wore helmets, and games were sometimes deadly. Commentator Frank DeFord says that began to change in November of 1909.
This month is the centennial of what has all but been forgotten, a moment that could have ended football in America, but instead forced the sport down a different, better path. Football was so gruesome at the turn of the century that in 1905, no less than President Roosevelt himself demanded that the sport clean itself up, and the notorious flying wedge was banned. However, by '09, as they said back then, it was still a brutal battle royal. In the season's championship match, what may be called the first game of the century, the New York Times summed it up as an indescribable tangle of bodies, arms, and legs. That game on November 20th between two undefeateds, Yale and Harvard, was typical of the era. There were no touchdowns. In fact, when Yale won 8-0, it finished its whole season completely unscored upon. The forward pass had been legalized in a limited fashion, but football was mostly just pounding scrimmage. Few players wore helmets, and a close observer declared that as Harvard and Yale pummeled each other, it was the most magnificent sight. Every lineman's face was dripping with blood. But the great game of 100 years ago was overshadowed by greater carnage at other major universities. 3 weeks before, when Harvard played at West Point, an Army lineman named Eugene Byrne was killed. Then 2 Saturdays after that, against Georgetown in the nation's capital, the star University of Virginia halfback Archer Christian met his death. The Chicago Tribune reported that 26 players had been killed on the gridiron that year. How long would America allow its brave youth to perish for a silly game? The president of Stanford, disgusted, called football rugby's American pervert. And an even more fascinating critic was Colonel John Mosby, who, as the fabled Confederate gray ghost, had certainly seen more than his share of death and mayhem during the Civil War. The old warrior called football a barbarous amusement that develops the brute dormant in man's nature and puts the player on a level with a polar bear. In the face of such withering, widespread criticism, the country's new Collegiate Athletic Association was forced to find ways to reduce football's dangers. Rules liberalizing the pass were instituted for the 1910 season, and soon it became the weapon that opened up a safer game. Of course, some things never change for the better. Canny old Colonel Mosby also made this point. It is notorious that football teams are largely composed of professional mercenaries who are hired to advertise colleges. Gate money is the valuable consideration. The Gray Ghost wrote that exactly a century ago, and although the NCAA could clean up the game on the field, it never has figured out how to manage the other abuses.
On the breeze, rustling through the leafy trees, and its mellow tones are these: Illinois, Illinois, and its mellow tones are these:
The story of Frederick Douglass Fritz Pollard spans generations.
My earliest memory of him was when he gave me this football and would take me around in the backyard and show me how to run pass patterns.
That's Fritz Pollard III. He's the grandson of Fritz Pollard.
The first time he knocked me down, I was sort of shocked that he hit me that hard. But then I realized that I wasn't hurt, so you just get up. And you just keep getting up.
That was a lesson Fritz Pollard the Elder was well qualified to teach. Fritz Pollard was born in Chicago in 1894, the 7th of 8 children. His mother was Native American, his father an African American who boxed professionally during the Civil War. Pollard ran track and played baseball and football at Chicago's Lane Tech High School, where his athleticism was celebrated. In 1915, he enrolled at Brown University on a Rockefeller scholarship, and things changed.
His teammates basically really wouldn't talk to him or anything until they saw what he could do.
What Pollard could do was rack up yards, 60, 70, and 80 yards at a time. Once he got the ball, the tough 5'6" halfback flew downfield, his trademark baggy football pants flapping in the breeze.
Once they saw his talent, he won them over, and his personality also won them over. So from then on, they had his back no matter what.
That would be useful. As the only African American on the field, Pollard was the subject of verbal abuse and worse. In the college game of 1915, punching, kicking, and eye gouging at the bottom of the pig pile were routine. Pollard was often a target.
He learned how to protect himself by rolling over and kicking his feet like a cat if somebody tried to pile on and drag their feet on him to cut him.
His teammates also protected him.
They would all wear baggy uniforms so that way no one could tell in the game who he was. And sometimes they even darkened their faces with shoe polish so they couldn't tell who he was.
Is that true?
Yes.
During games?
During games. Back then, in 1915 and 1916, that's unheard of.
But there was little Pollard's teammates could do to protect him from abusive fans.
They had death threats when they played certain schools in certain areas. And these were Ivy League schools that still were as racist as anywhere else. It went all through the country.
There were times when he had to be escorted onto the field by the police.
That's Dr. Stephen Towns, another of Fritz Pollard's grandsons.
The Yale fans used to sing "Bye Bye Blackbird" when he came on the field.
Brown earned an invitation to the 1916 Rose Bowl. The New Year's Day game against Washington State almost didn't happen. Pollard's grandsons know the story, which began at the team's hotel.
They wouldn't let my grandfather sign in. So they said, well, take us back to the train station because if you won't let him stay, we're going back. Brown was going back to Rhode Island if they weren't going to let my grandfather stay in the hotel.
The team then refused to stay, and the hotel worked it out.
Meaning what exactly?
Meaning they let him stay.
Pollard had become the first black player in Rose Bowl history, and he would go on to break other barriers. After a stint in the Army at the end of World War I and 3 years coaching Lincoln University's football team, Fritz Pollard signed with the Akron Pros for the inaugural season of the American Professional Football Association, the forerunner of the NFL. He was one of a handful of black players in the league, and he flourished.
He rarely came out of the game. He played quarterback, he was running back, he did punt returns, kickoff returns. He even did the punts and the kicks, where they used to do the drop kick for the field goal. There wasn't a thing he didn't touch in the game.
Pollard's accomplishments notwithstanding, Aaron Dodson of ESPN's The Undefeated says not everyone welcomed him into the pros.
And there was a group of players who just didn't really like the fact that this black man was not only in the league, but he was also an elite player in the league.
Pollard spoke about that in a 1974 NFL Films interview.
I look at him and grin. Didn't get mad and want to fight him. Just looked at him and grinned, and the next minute run 80 yards for a touchdown.
He did that a lot. Before the Akron Pros' first game against the powerhouse Canton Bulldogs, he tried it out on a football legend.
Jim Thorpe walked up to him and said, "Do you know who I am?" And he goes, "Yes, I know who you are. I've heard about you." And he goes, "Well, I've heard about you too." And he called him the N-word. And my grandfather, not to miss a step, called him the N-word. And Thorpe just sort of stepped back and looked at him. He said he was going to kill my grandfather. He said, "Well, if you're ready to kill me, you can find me down there in your end zone." And the opening play, my grandfather took the kickoff all the way back for a touchdown. And he's waving for Jim Thorpe to come on. And after the game, Thorpe said, he's the best back he's ever seen.
Pollard led his Akron team to an 8-0-3 season and the very first pro football title. According to Stephen Towns, after that, the star player of the Decatur Staleys let the football world know that he, too, disapproved of Pollard's presence.
George Halas said he'd never play a team with the N-word on it again.
George Halas was one of the NFL's founders and a future Hall of Famer. Despite Halas's hatred, or maybe because of it, Pollard was a major draw. Some fans showed up to see him run. Others to see him get pummeled. Some credit Pollard and Jim Thorpe with saving the league, which struggled early on to compete with baseball, boxing, and horse racing. Because of his star power, Pollard was well paid. He made $1,500 a game by one estimate. That's about $20,000 these days. In 1921, Pollard became the NFL's first black head coach when he was named Akron's player coach. In 1923, he became the first black professional quarterback. But Stephen Towns says his grandfather didn't receive the respect he should have.
Unfortunately, he used to have to get dressed in his car. Can you imagine that? Your star player having to get dressed in his car and then come onto the field?
In some ways, it's hard to quantify just how good Fritz Pollard was as a player, because stats from the 1920s are unreliable and incomplete. Fritz Pollard's pro football playing career ended in 1926. The following year, there were no African Americans in pro football. Pollard had already begun a career as an entrepreneur. He had established the first black-owned investment firm in the U.S. in 1922. He would go on to be a newspaper mogul and talent agent for many black entertainers, including Lena Horne and Pollard's former Akron Pros teammate, Paul Robeson. Pollard flourished as a businessman, but in the early 30s, he noticed a disturbing development in the NFL, and it motivated him. Again, Aaron Dodson.
In 1933, the league sort of enacted this gentleman's agreement that barred African-American players from the league, and he took it upon himself to continue those opportunities for those black players who had proven, like himself, that they were able to play in the National Football League at the highest level.
Pollard's response was to barnstorm with a team that included Jackie Robinson's older brother Mac and Paul Robeson. They called themselves the Brown Bombers.
Named after Joe Louis.
Dr. Charles Ross is Director of African American Studies at the University of Mississippi.
They play out of Harlem. He was the coach of that team. And ultimately, he really wanted for them to showcase their talents and potentially apply pressure to NFL owners to have to answer as to why black players are not on these NFL rosters, to say, hey, we're pretty successful. We're very competitive against these white semi-pro teams. How come they aren't given this opportunity to play in the National Football League?
Fritz Pollard III says they were more than competitive.
The Brown Bombers were 29-0. Never lost a game. Their talent was just so incredible. It had to have been some kind of team.
Stephen Towns agrees.
They were beating some of the pro teams so badly that they had to hold the score down because they were afraid that they weren't going to play them anymore. So it was a little bit more than an exhibition game. When you got white players at that point in time playing black players, it meant something.
The Brown Bombers folded in 1938, one of the many casualties of the Great Depression. It's hard to know exactly how much pressure Pollard's barnstorming team put on the NFL, but the league finally reintegrated in 1946. Fritz Pollard faded out of the public eye in the decades following the demise of the Brown Bombers. Again, Aaron Dodson.
He really didn't talk about his legacy in terms of the league. He was a very reserved man, and once his football career was over, it was over.
Pollard focused on his family and his businesses. He watched from a distance as Jim Thorpe, George Preston Marshall, and George Halas, who had opposed the inclusion of black players in the pros, were inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame's inaugural class of 1963. But as time went on, Pollard's legend grew until some of the league's most powerful men took notice. One of them was NFL Commissioner Paul Tagliabue, who, according to Stephen Towns, would hand out books celebrating his grandfather's life.
Tagliabue told me that he kept a case of books, and he said he would pass those out to people who would come into his office because he was just so amazed at my grandfather's accomplishment.
Frederick Douglass Fritz Pollard died in 1986 at the age of 92. He was finally inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2005, along with Dan Marino, Steve Young, and Benny Friedman. Stephen Towns was at the ceremony. So was Fritz Pollard III. He says his grandfather was too positive to allow the Hall's refusal to induct him in his lifetime to get him down. But that was no excuse for the delay.
He should have been in the founding class. There's no doubt about it. And most of the Hall of Famers say he should have been in the founding class.
Pollard's influence lives on, thanks in part to the efforts of the Fritz Pollard Alliance, which promotes equal NFL coaching and front office opportunities for minorities. Former NFL player and FPA chairman John Wooten says Pollard was the obvious choice to be that organization's inspiration.
All-American, first black to play in the Rose Bowl, outstanding coming from Brown, So when we started the organization, that's why we took the name that we took.
Wooten is perhaps fighting an uphill battle these days, as evidenced by the recent controversy surrounding the Oakland Raiders' recent hiring of Jon Gruden to a 10-year head coaching deal without interviewing a single minority candidate, as per the NFL's Rooney Rule. Dr. Charles Ross worries that the league and a younger generation of fans still doesn't appreciate Pollard's significance.
It's really a shame that he's someone that really remains kind of in the shadows. He's someone that really deserves a lot more exposure, a lot more recognition based upon the circumstances that he faced and what he was able to achieve.
Consider the progress that's been made in the 3 decades since the death of Fritz Pollard. He's now a Hall of Famer. A watchdog organization bears his name. Black quarterbacks are no longer considered novelties. Maybe in this sense, Fritz Pollard just keeps getting up.
Being a high school football hero was heady stuff for young Pollard, but his life was not all touchdowns and glory. As one of the few black players in the Chicago Interscholastic League, he received more than his share of verbal and physical abuse. Most opposing teams singled him out as a target for rough play, piling on, and outright illegal acts aimed at injuring him. Although his teammates did their best to protect him, they did not always succeed. After a 1911 road game against Rockford High School, the Tech Prep noted that they were laying for Pollard up there, but they missed him. To combat the dangerous situation, Pollard used a unique tactic that during the course of his career became one of his trademarks and discouraged would-be ruffians intent upon maiming him. When tackled, he would roll over on his back, cock his legs, and flail them bicycle style to prevent piling on. Despite this technique and the training his brothers had given him, Pollard sustained several injuries during his senior year, at least one the result of dirty play. In an account of a game against University High, the Tech Prep reported curtly that Pollard went out of the game after a kick in the back and would miss the next game. Pollard later admitted that he was roughed up many times in high school games and maintained that he was also the target of racial slurs. In the beginning, they were pretty rough, Pollard said, but I had been taught to take care of myself, and maybe I didn't realize exactly how rough they really were. In 1970, when Pollard was asked if he had experienced any racial discrimination when he played at Lang Tech, he replied emphatically, "There were problems. There were problems." He seemed most incensed by incidents in which his coach and teammates became accomplices in acts of discrimination. One such episode occurred as a result of a non-league game against a team in Southern Illinois. Coach R.F. Webster told Pollard to report to the train station at a certain time on a Saturday morning, but the team had departed by the time Fritz got there. As Pollard related the story, "Another train came in, and I took the train. They said it didn't stop at this particular place, and I got off about 8 or 10 miles down, and I walked all the way back to where we were playing. And I found out when I got back that it was done on purpose because this team down in Southern Illinois didn't want to play against me, and they had no way of telling me no, so they pulled that stunt on me." When asked if he meant that his own team had pulled the stunt, Pollard replied, "Yes, my own team." Even the intervening years had not fully soothed the hurt and disappointment Pollard felt because his coach and teammates had let him down on that autumn Saturday some 60 years before. Pollard remembered a similar incident that occurred in November 1910 when Lane journeyed to Wisconsin to play against St. John's Military Academy. A group of St. John's cadets greeted the Lane 11 at the railroad station and escorted them to the campus. Pollard recalled that a couple of the cadets threw their arms around him, guided him around the military compound, and took him to dinner. The next day, when Coach Webster picked the team to go out and play, he went up to Fritz and said, "Pollard, this is a practice game. I think we'd better save you." At the time, Pollard recalled, I didn't have any more sense than believe him. After the game, however, several of the cadets who had treated him royally the day before told him, "Nigger, we did all that to keep you out of the game." Pollard was outwardly calm about the incident at the time. He later said, because my brothers and my dad had taught me to handle those things, and I never lost my head about it. I just figured it was another thing that came along.
Flowing, Illinois, Illinois, by thy prairies verdance growing, Illinois, Illinois, comes and...
The year 1915 was not an encouraging one for African Americans. Woodrow Wilson, the first Southern-born president since the Civil War, was in the process of implementing his executive order segregating Negro federal employees in their workplaces. The wartime migration of Southern blacks to northern cities created competition for jobs. American Marines invaded the Black Republic of Haiti in order to restore internal order, killing several hundred Haitians in the process. In Cuba, Jack Johnson lost the heavyweight championship to Jess Willard as a result of a controversial knockout. The movie director D.W. Griffith released his blatantly racist film, The Birth of a Nation, sparking black protests across the country. In Alabama, Colonel William J. Simmons revived the Ku Klux Klan, touching off numerous incidents of racial violence. Late in the year, the esteemed civil rights leader Booker T. Washington died, leaving a vacuum in the movement that would be difficult to fill. In the early 1970s, Pollard calmly reflected on how he dealt with the racial barriers he had faced during his early days in pro football. My father had taught me that I was too big to be humiliated by prejudiced whites, he told a black sports writer. If I figured a hotel or restaurant didn't want me, I stayed away. I didn't go sniffing around hoping they'd accept me. I was never interested in socializing with whites. I was there to play football and make my money. By the 1920 season, Pollard was one of the best paid players in the APFA, possibly second only to Thorpe. He was paid well because he was a spectacular player and thus a gate attraction, and also because of his race. As a small black player, facing the then giants of the gridiron, Pollard was a curiosity. Some fans came out to cheer him, while others hurled racial insults at him and possibly hoped he would be maimed. They did turn out to see him, however, at Akron's League Park and other fields around the APFA. Pollard was also well paid because he began to assume duties as an Akron coach beginning late in the 1919 season. Although reliable sources indicate that he became the first black APFA NFL head coach beginning in 1921, when he shared that position with the former Penn State halfback L.G. Tobin. Pollard maintained that he began coaching in Akron in 1919. The long-standing controversy over when Pollard became the first black coach in the soon-to-be NFL is understandable, because the position of professional head coach was much different then than it is today. Pro teams placed less emphasis on who was head coach than did the colleges. According to pro football pioneer Pierce Johnson, coaches had a limited role. The difference between then and now, Johnson stated, is that the coach could not coach from the sidelines. Not at all. He had to sit in one place on the bench, so the captain really called the game. In addition, if a substitute entered the game and talked to the quarterback, the referee was supposed to call a penalty. Pollard maintained that in conjunction with Purdy, he introduced the more wide-open system of play they had learned at Brown to the Akron team beginning in 1919. From that point on, he insisted, I was really the head coach. Even though the record books don't give me credit, I coached Akron in 1919, 1920, and in 1921 when the league became the National Football League. The first showdown match of the initial APFA season in 1920 was the always exciting clash between Akron and Canton. Undefeated in 4 games, the pros traveled to Canton in late October to meet the Bulldogs, who were undefeated in league play. Richard Leshner, an Akron resident at the time, recalled that, always, this game was a titanic struggle between contrary styles. The small but magic Pollard arrayed against the lightning-fast Thorpe. Closing my eyes, I can see them now. As I said, a personal duel. Not passing, not the quarterback, but 2 running and tackling backs. Beautiful to behold. Pollard remembered arriving in Canton late that Sunday morning because his Lincoln team had played and defeated Shaw University 28-0 the previous day in Philadelphia's Baker Bowl. He immediately heard rumors that Thorpe had been going around town betting that nigger's scared to come and play. When Pollard entered the Cortlandt Hotel, Thorpe was standing in the lobby. As Pollard later recalled, I saw him and said, "Oh, hello there, black boy." He turned around, looked at me, and replied, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "Just what I said." Pollard later maintained, perhaps referring to his own Indian ancestry, that Jim Thorpe was as black as I was. What Pollard meant by the remark remains unclear. It was common in that era, however, for white players to assert that opponents with darker skin had Negro blood. Babe Ruth, for example, who had a swarthy complexion, would sometimes become uncontrollably angry when the opposition called him a Negro or worse. It is clear that Pollard did not mean the remark as a compliment. The confrontation continued a few hours later at Lakeside Park before a crowd estimated at more than 10,000. Akron took a 10-0 lead in the first half on a Charles Copley field goal and a 50-yard touchdown run by tackle Pike Johnson on an intercepted pass. Early in the second half, Thorpe entered the game for the first time, and the Canton squad put on a desperate offensive with both Thorpe and Guyon making substantial gains through the line. The Canton drive failed to produce a score, however, as Thorpe's 18-yard field goal attempt hit the crossbar and fell away. Pollard recalled that he was playing defensive quarterback and returning punts, and that Thorpe tried to get me when we had the ball. But I ran offside, twisted and squirmed, and kept out of his way. In the most memorable play of the game, the frustrated Thorpe ordered his punter to kick short to Pollard, while Jim and his former Carlisle teammate, Joe Guyon, sprinted downfield with the intent of knocking Pollard out of the game. According to the historian Harry A. March, the Indians particularly hated Pollard and laid for him. The punt carried 30 yards past the line of scrimmage and high enough that the Indians could cover it easily and be ready for the kill. When Pollard caught the ball, Guyon did a flying tackle on the one side and Thorpe on the other. As the ball struck his ready hands, Pollard dropped face down on the ground. The Indians' heads collided like the impact of locomotives. Both were unconscious and did not play any longer that half. while Pollard leaped to his feet and carried the ball back to the line of scrimmage. As with many early pro football tales, March embellished the story. He placed the incident early in the game, when in fact, Thorpe did not enter the contest until the second half. The game account also shows that neither Guyon nor Thorpe was replaced in the third or fourth periods. Pollard gave a similar account of the incident, placing it correctly in the second half, but he mistakenly had himself scoring a touchdown on the play. While the legend of the Thorpe-Pollard rivalry has been magnified over the years, there is little doubt that they were two of the talented crowd-pleasing stars of the early APFA. Akron's 10-0 victory over Canton was one of the few league games widely reported upon by the national press and major African-American newspapers because it marked the first defeat for Thorpe's Bulldogs since 1917. A second showdown game was scheduled for Akron's League Park on Thanksgiving Day, where the once-defeated Bulldogs hoped to derail the pros who remained unbeaten in their bid to become the mythical world champions of professional football. A collegiate tradition, Thanksgiving Day contests were then uncommon in professional football because a number of players like Pollard coached college or high school teams that had important games set for the day. But almost all of the players showed up in Akron, including Pollard, because of the importance of the professional game. Soon after the Buffalo game, while Pollard was preparing to play in a postseason game for the Union Athletic Association against Thorpe and the Canton Bulldogs in Philadelphia, he received a call from Hallis, the coach and right end for the Decatur Staleys, who proposed a game between his team and Akron for December 12th at Cubs Park in Chicago. The Staleys, owned by a Decatur, Illinois starch manufacturer, had one loss and one tie in 12 games, and had declared themselves professional champions of the West. Pollard had known Hallis from their high school days in Chicago, and according to Fritz, he did Hallis a favor by begging out of the Philadelphia exhibition contest and urging his reluctant teammates to schedule the game with Decatur. We had won the world championship, and the Akron team didn't want to go to Chicago, Pollard admitted. But I said, I'm a Chicago boy. Let's go. Pollard's interest in the contest was no doubt heightened by the fact that he had not performed in Chicago since his semi-pro days in 1912. The Akron team and management agreed to the game, which would lead to a long-standing feud between Pollard and Hallis. 12,000 Chicagoans, the largest crowd to see a professional game in the city, turned out in damp weather to see the Eastern and Western champions collide. The teams fought to a scoreless tie on the slippery turf, with Akron dominating the first half and the Staleys the second. In the later recollections of Hallis and Pollard, the story of the game became clouded by the omission of significant facts, half-truths, and blatant embellishment. Hallis mistakenly recalled in his autobiography that he intercepted a pass, broke into the clear, and should have scored, but slipped. He failed to note that he broke league rules by hiring Patty Driscoll of the Chicago Cardinals to play halfback for the Staleys that day. In his only mention of Pollard, Hallis asserted correctly that he managed to tackle the Akron star on several occasions. Pollard's recollection of the game was no better. He mistakenly recalled making 2 touchdown runs, which were nullified by phantom penalties called by a hometown referee. He undoubtedly exaggerated the importance of the game when he implied that the Akron-Decatur contest was the making of Hallis, who had moved the Staleys to Chicago the following year and became co-owner of the team, renamed the Chicago Bears in 1922. He used me to get recognized, Pollard said. And then Hallis refused to play Akron the next year unless Akron dropped me. and he refused to play Milwaukee the next year when I went up there. Pollard complained bitterly in a 1976 interview that George Halas used me to get every goddamn thing he could. Then after he used me and got power, he raised the prejudice barrier. If George Halas was still like he was then, he wouldn't have allowed a black player in Chicago because he was as prejudiced as hell. When confronted with Pollard's charges in the mid-1970s, Halas refuted them all. He's a liar. At no time did the color of skin matter. All I cared about was the color of blood. If you had red blood, I was for you. When asked why there were no blacks in the NFL from 1934 until after World War II, Halas replied somewhat lamely that he did not know. Probably the game didn't have the appeal to black players at the time. Halas concluded by saying that Pollard was trying to involve me in something so he can have something to talk about. There is nothing to it. He was a fine football player, but Jesus. Although he did not sign a black player during this period, Halas's Chicago team continued to play NFL teams that included black players through the 1933 season.
By thy rivers gently flowing, Illinois, Illinois.
You might have noticed an unusual throwback the Chicago Bears wore in yesterday's affair against the Vikings at Soldier Field. The 1936 season also fell in an era when there were no African-American players in the NFL. The Bears' official Twitter account tweeted this video. They were worn for one full season, 1936. Ponder this. Does anything at all strike the cognitive thought when objectively viewing this photo of the 1936 Chicago Bears? It looks awfully overtly disenfranchising an entire race, barring entry into the National Football League through mandated practices. That's because 1936 was the third season of the NFL's 12-year ban on black players, a ban in which George Halas almost certainly played a central role, per Windy City Gridiron. This dates back to Washington's George Preston Marshall, the man who changed the team's name to a racial slur and served as the last owner to integrate in 1962, and whose last pillar of support came from the American Nazi Party. In the book Papa Bear, Marshall urged his fellow owners to realize that in the midst of the Depression, with white fans out of work, black players were bad for business. Marshall was credited as having led the initial ban at a pivotal owners meeting in February of 1933. However, he needed support for his racial motives. What makes the NFL so unique is that it's a full-fledged league and it starts off integrated. What you're hinting at is the historical amnesia that we do have, said historian Lewis Moore. That's right, from the league's inception to 1936, it was fully integrated, and then suddenly they were all gone. There was no press release, nothing on paper. Over the years, the owners involved maintained that no such ban ever occurred. Halas, in particular, twice offered implausible explanations as to why the league had black players during its first 14 years and none for the next 12. He would say probably it was due to the fact that no great black players were in colleges then. He also said there was no ban in no way, shape, or form. The best college player eligible for the 1939 season was running back Kenny Washington. The NFL draft that year, 22 rounds. Guess where Kenny Washington was selected? Not in a single slot. In 1989, a fellow black player, Ozzie Simmons of the Hawkeyes, told the Iowa City Press Citizen, George Halas said, "Ozzie, I'd like to use you, but we have an unwritten rule in the National League, and that is blacks can't play." Going back to Preston Marshall, he and Halas are linked forever. They were friends. When the owners and the league commissioner posed for a photo, the two men stood side by side with Marshall's arm around Halas' shoulder. Marshall was, Halas wrote, the canniest promoter and greatest talker to come into since Charles C. Pyle. As Jack Silverstein writes, everything that happened in that 33 meeting happened because of Halas and Marshall, including the ban. Small market teams signed black players, and guess what happened? Halas and Co. slimmed the league down from 22 to 12, limiting the quantity of African Americans in the league through opportunities. One Pro Football Researchers Association article in 1988 assigned responsibility to Marshall, Halas, and Art Rooney, adding that NFL President Joseph Carr sanctioned it. Yet, the fact remains, Halas's Bears did not have any black players before the ban, did not challenge the ban, and then had another 6 seasons after the ban before debuting a black player. The jerseys are set to make another appearance on December 5th, a nationally televised Thursday night game against the Dallas Cowboys.
By thy rivers gently flowing, Illinois, Illinois. By thy prairies verdance growing, Illinois, Illinois. Comes an echo on the breeze, rustling through the leafy trees, and its mellow tones are these, Illinois, Illinois, and its mellow tones are these, Illinois.
The Pollards were a solid middle-class family that posed no apparent threat to their neighbors, but they were also victims of the prevalent racism which infected American society in the early 20th century. For example, just after World War I, George Jean Nathan and H.L. Mencken wrote The American Credo, which listed 435 beliefs commonly accepted by Americans. Among the truisms whites held about blacks were that Negroes' votes may be readily bought for $1, that educated Negroes refuse to work and become criminals, that all Negroes who show any intelligence are 2/3 white and the sons of U.S. senators, and that as soon as Negroes get $8, they go to a dentist to have a front tooth filled with gold.
Pack up all my care and woe, my woe. Here I go, I'm singing, low. Bye bye, my blackbird, where somebody waits for me. Sugar sweet, and so is he. Bye bye, my blackbird.
Welcome to a special Black History Month episode of NFL 360. I'm Steve Weich. If we're asked to name the first African American to play modern Major League Baseball, we don't hesitate to answer. But if we're asked to name the first African American to play and coach professional football, most of us don't know. And it's time we did. Because long before Jackie Robinson, there was Fritz Pollard. Join us now as Nate Burleson leads us on a journey to rediscover a forgotten man.
Blackbird, blackbird, bye bye.
My father came from Oklahoma. There, going to school and working in a barbershop, he met my mother, who was born in Oklahoma. And they were married in Oklahoma. And they left Oklahoma and they moved up to a place called Rogers Park, which is way on the north side of Chicago.
No one can ever love or understand me.
I mean, if you were an African American at an Ivy League school, then that means you were a leg up on African Americans in the ACC. Oh, wait, because there were none. Or in the SEC, oh, wait, because there were none. Or in with the old Southwest Conference, oh, wait, because there were none. So you basically had African Americans going to school and being able to compete in, what, 3 conferences? I guess you clearly had the Ivy League, you had the Big Ten, you had the Pac-8. The Ivy League probably had as many who had prominent roles as any of those leagues.
Up all my care and woe, my woe. Here I go, I'm singing low. Bye bye, my blackbird.
As we sit here on the steps of Brown, there's one question that keeps popping in my head. How did a young black kid from Chicago in 1915 end up here at Brown University?
Well, he bounced around. He had his older brother was at Dartmouth. He had played football for Dartmouth, and from what I understand, I've heard Leslie was a better ball player than my grandfather.
What?
Yes, that's what I heard. So I grew up hearing that, and he taught my grandfather how to play. He went to Dartmouth because that's where Leslie was, and he wanted to be with Leslie. And Leslie said, "No, this isn't the school for you." He came down here finally, and he came to Brown. The football players gave him a hard time at first. They gave him the last uniform they had, which was all torn up and everything, had holes in it. That night, my grandfather stitched everything up, patched all the holes.
And he was the only black guy on the team?
Only black guy. Can you imagine being thrust in the area where basically you're the only one? It's shocking. His personality was so bubbling that basically he won people over. He dug in and wanted to open the doors for everybody to prove that everyone, no matter what color your skin is, you're an equal. Everyone should be given a chance.
No one can ever love or understand me.
Becoming the first African American to play in the granddaddy of them all. In the following season, he was even better.
The 1916 team was Brown's best team to date in history. They had 6 shutouts in 9 games. We had never beaten Harvard. They blew Harvard out of Harvard Stadium, 21-0. Fritz had an amazing game. They called him the human torpedo because he ran low to the ground. He had a dodge step that would put people on the ground grasping at air.
148 yards and 2 touchdowns in the Harvard win, coupled with 144 yards in the touchdown in the win over Yale. 2 teams Brown had never beaten the same season, led to Fritz becoming the first African-American back to be named to Walter Camp's All-American team, and cemented his place as a Brown legend.
I'm singing low. Bye bye, my blackbird, where somebody waits for me. Sugar sweet, and so is he. Bye bye, my blackbird. Now let me just tell ya no one.
In the Yale Bowl, he was serenaded by the Blackbird song.
Correct.
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, the Blackbird song was a derisive song. It haunted him all his life. Later, when he was in his late 80s, frail, sitting there on a couch with James Michener being interviewed, and Michener leaned over and said, "They sang songs about you, didn't they?" And Fritz said, "Yeah, bye bye Blackbird." And then he proceeded to go, ba 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 ba, bye bye Blackbird.
Bye bye Blackbird, blah 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 blah. Bye bye Blackbird.
And the tears started coming down his cheeks, and it was clear that as much as he tried to get past that and put it aside, the hurt was still there. Years and years later, which is a lesson to everybody. And when I think about Pollard and his legacy, my feeling is what he taught us was how to be the best person we can be, how to deal with all kinds of crapola which people threw at him, and still be positive about life. He was a positive life force, and he wanted us all to be the best person we could be. Even though I didn't know him, I've really taken that to heart, and I think that he was a great role model because he really empowered people around him.
Tonight, blackbird, 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 bye-bye, gotta go right now, bye-bye.
Well, Jim, during these things where there's plenty of people used to call me every kind of a name. And when I went out to play against Jim with Canton, Ohio, and Jim said, "Hello, little black boy." I said, "Hello, big black boy." And he looked at me, you know. he was dumbfounded. He didn't expect me to return some epithet like I did. I said, "Well, we're going to play against each other. We'll find out who's going to be the blackest after this game." and he laughed, you know. And then he called the other two Indians over and introduced them to me. And fortunately, Akron won the game, and I happened to be the star of the game, scored points, and we beat. That's the first time Canton had ever been beaten. And Jim and myself became pretty friendly. For years and years, my father had taught us how to not pay any attention to anything like that. Even in intercollegiate football, guys used to, "Hello, little black boy," and things like that, the Yale team and the Harvard team, you know. And I got so, and even out where I lived, in the community in which I lived, people used to say, "Oh, that's that little black boy, that athlete," this and that and the other thing. So it was one of those things that I became accustomed to, because I knew that if I didn't pay any attention to it, they would be apologetic a little later when they met me by saying, "Well, we didn't know anything about you. You didn't get mad because we called you little black boy." I said, "What are you talking about?" Well, in playing against Carlisle and being as small as I was, no one had any sympathy for me at all. And they used to come in on me, and when they came in on me, they used to hit me, one on top, one below, in order to try to take me out. But my brothers had taught me how to spin out of those kind of things. And then when they would do it, they would say, "Well, you little black, I'll get you the next time." So that the next time they'd tear into me, and one of them would tear at my knees, the other one would tear at my head, and I would spin just the same and twirl around. Fortunately, my brothers, as I said, had taught me what to do, and I never got hurt.
What happened in the game against Canton when the two guys got knocked out? How did
Well, the same trick that I just spoke of. I spun around, and they both hit each other. And they didn't hit me and whatnot, and I had run into that on several occasions during my intercollegiate career, and I had practiced and had learned how to handle those situations. The fact of the matter is, my brothers had taught me all those kind and types of tricks. Unless they held on to me completely when I was spinning around. But they didn't, they couldn't hold on to me completely.
So make my bed and light the light, because I'll arrive home late tonight. Blackbird, blackbird, bye, bye, bye.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired.
Today it's time
time to stop singing and start swinging.
We're coming to get our check.
You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio. And I'm your host, JohnGHorse. Welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place. P.A.R. is a family-friendly information distribution program seeking to inform non-white people, in particular, black classified, and assisting and counter-racist codification. The title of today's episode is Frederick, Douglass, Fritz, Pollard, and All-American Talent. One more again, the title of today's episode is Frederick, Douglass, Fritz, Pollard, and All-American Talent. Let's get it in, family. And in order to stay on top of the information, we gotta get up early in the morning. Yeah. You know how we do it, family. Early in the morning, family.
You are now listening to P.A.R. That's People Activity Radio, hosted by JohnGHorse, a blue-collar commentary radio podcast attempting to remove confusion in everyday social events. If you are subject to non-white classification, in particular black classified, welcome. You have found your family in a peaceful place.
You have indeed found your family in a peaceful place. And I am your gracious and humble host, JohnGHorse. You know how we do, family. We use that foundation United States Black Classified spiritual energy. Run it back. Yes, indeed. And this is P.A.R. People Activity Radio. And let me repeat the title of today's episode one more time. The title of today's episode is Frederick, Douglass, Fritz, Pollard, and All-American Talent. Playing past racism. Yes, indeed. One more time. Frederick, Douglass, Fritz, Pollard, and All-American Talent. Playing past racism. Yes, indeed. Where do we begin? As always, the question. And before I get into my dissertation, you understand me? I'd like to thank all of the listeners for digging in their pockets, pulling out all quarters, pennies, nickels, and dimes, and contributing to old JohnGHorse's Cash App, and all proceeds given to the Cash App will be used to help maintain a competitive, produced show. Let's move on.
JohnGHorse's Cash App is $John, capital J, O, H, N, capital G, capital H, O, R, S, E.
Yes, indeed. Now that we've got the particulars out of the way, this goes out to all the hard-working class, blue-collar, law-abiding citizens subject to black classification in these United States. Get up early in the morning. That's when you rise. Yes, indeed. I get up early in the morning. That's when I rise in order to provide constructive information as it pertains to people subject to non-white, in particular, black classification in these United States of America. And again, we are discussing one of the greatest athletes in this United States experiment called the United States of America. We are discussing Frederick Douglass Pollard, also known as Fritz Pollard, the first superstar NFL player subject to black classification allowed to actually participate and compete against people who classify themselves as white. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Where should I begin? I want to start off the show by setting the atmosphere in which our ancestor, Frederick Douglass Pollard, was in middle school. I believe Frederick Douglass Pollard graduated in 1915, but he was in either 8th or 9th grade in 1910 when the late, great Jack Johnson won the heavyweight championship of the world, and he was the first person subject to black classification to be allowed to compete for the heavyweight championship. And back then in 1910, this was a huge deal. This was a pillar of white supremacist community, meaning the most supreme, most masculine male, which was the heavyweight champion of the world, represented white supremacy. And that term white supremacy is not a term that we made up. That's not a term that we acquiesce to say that people who classify themselves as white are supreme. No, this is the term that was created by those men and women who have been dominating the globe for the last 400 years. They termed themselves that. So to be accurate, we use the term that we can reference historically from those people who are, at this point, as I understand it, and I could be in error if I'm talking crazy, to this point, who are dominating the planet. They seem to all classify themselves as white. Let's move on. That being said, Jack Johnson had beat the current heavyweight champion in 1910, and our ancestor Fritz Pollard was in the 8th or 9th grade. He hadn't even began high school yet. And I'm bringing this up to acknowledge that when Jack Johnson won that heavyweight championship, Lord have mercy. There was riots all over the United States, and I say there were terrorist attacks all over the United States, and there was counter-terror being practiced by people subject to black classification. So you had white folks and black folks nationwide, all over the country, having literally a race war because somebody subject to black classification. Jack Johnson, who was subject to black classification, had won the heavyweight championship of the world. Now, I am just saying that to set the palette of today's episode. And it's going to be a quick hitter episode. And to give you an understanding, it has been said, it has been written that there was no larger civil unrest comparable to the Jack Johnson riots outside of when the late great ancestor Martin Luther King had been assassinated. The country turned bloody. So in 1910, the only thing that we can compare to the complete mayhem in the United States is Jack Johnson's victory as heavyweight champion of the world and Martin Luther King's assassination by suspected white supremacists. And there were riots in Atlanta, Cincinnati, Houston, New York, St. Louis, Keystone, West Virginia, Mounds, Illinois, Baltimore, Chicago, Clarksburg, West Virginia, Columbus, Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, Fort Worth, Johnson County, Missouri, Kansas City, Missouri, Little Rock, Los Angeles, Louisville, New Orleans, Norfolk, Virginia, Omaha, Philadelphia, Roanoke, I don't even know what that is, Virginia, Springfield, Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri, and Wheeling, West Virginia, all saw racial disturbances. And you, if you don't believe me, don't take my word for it. Do your own research. Jack Johnson riots. Frederick Douglass Pollard was either in 8th or 9th grade. And when he entered high school, which was in 1911, that's the environment in which he is entering. Racial hostility sounds no different than what we're dealing with today. That being said, as he entered high school, he was one of the very few individuals in his high school in Chicago, Illinois, that was subject to black classification. As I understand it, he and his brothers and sisters were the only black people in his community. That meant that they were the only black people in the school. So he, being a very small young man, he was a small adult. I believe he only grew up to be about 5'6", 5'7", 180 pounds at best. And he is said to be one of the best athletes of his day. Now, to give you an example, Jim Thorpe was the great American athlete that I was taught about in my formative years in school, and I believe he was of Native American ancestry. I believe he had a Native American mama and a father who was who classified themselves as white. That's neither here nor there. That being said, I bring that up, but to bring up that Jim Thorpe was an imposing figure. 6'2", 6'3". I know he was above 6 foot, and he was a solid built man. Great athlete, for the lack of a better term. That being said, our ancestor Frederick Douglass Pollard, 5'6", 5'7", 155, 160 pounds at best. Now, they say he was a chiseled individual. Can you imagine one of the baddest football players to have the stature of an individual like what's the brother's name, the comedian, Kevin Hart? That's what we're talking about. That's how small Fritz Pollard was, and he dominated every football field that he put his feet on. That being said, he's going into high school as the only black player on his team, and he had to deal with anti-blackness from his coaches. He had to deal with anti-blackness from his teammates. He had to deal with anti-blackness from his opponents. He had to deal with anti-blackness wherever he went. If they had to go on a road trip and had to stay in a hotel overnight, he had to deal with hotels not allowing him, a child, Fritz Pollard, 15, 16, 17 years old, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old. He had to manage racism, white supremacy by himself. Why? There was no big brother. There was no mama. There was no cavalry coming to help him. This young man overcame all of that and became an all-city player in Chicago, Illinois. You understand me? That being said, by the time he graduated, which was 1915, racial conditions weren't any better. The movie Birth of a Nation had came out. We had a self-proclaimed white supremacist president, Woodrow Wilson, who played the movie Birth of a Nation in the White House, said it was the best thing since French toast. Woodrow Wilson is also the individual who introduced our current national anthem. He went real hard in the paint to get what we know now as the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, to be the United States national anthem. I think the national anthem before the Star-Spangled Banner was "This land is your land, this land is my land." Excuse me, family, I can't sing. I just had to give you an example of what I was talking about. I believe that was the national anthem. Woodrow Wilson went hard in the paint. Not only that, Woodrow Wilson went hard in the paint to disenfranchise people subject to black classification and segregate federal jobs. You understand me? And as he segregated federal jobs, most of the high wage paying jobs went to white folks, and the low paying jobs went to people subject to non-white, in particular, black classification. Yes, indeed. Not only did you have a self-proclaimed white supremacist in the White House, resegregating reestablishing black codes and Jim Crow laws in the United States all the way up into the federal sector. You also had the invasion of Haiti, or the occupation of Haiti, where a whole bunch of people subject to black classification was killed by Marines from the United States of America, all in an effort to so-called stabilize Haiti. Now, that's very interesting because we still have the same mess going on here. I'm sure all of us who are not under a rock saw the images and the news coverage of people from Haiti subject to black classification being hauled in like cattle with whips and horses, fleeing for their lives over at the Texas border. Yes, indeed. So 1915, 2021, same old story, same old song. You understand me? So our ancestor, 1950, goes into college. He goes into a couple of colleges and almost fell under the title of a tramp athlete, meaning he went to Dartmouth. He went to University of Pennsylvania. I mean, he went to a whole bunch of institutions. Then he wound up at Brown University, which is an Ivy League university, and found his eligibility, and he wound up making the Brown University team, who was, for the lack of a better term, a sorry program. Once Frederick Douglass Pollard, also known as Fritz Pollard. I don't want to disrespect the ancestor by calling him by his nickname, but for time constraints, I'm going to refer to him as Fritz Pollard. But for the family, his name was Frederick Douglass Pollard, also known as Fritz. Fritz Pollard made the Brown University team. He got mistreated and name called by the teammates who classified themselves as white. They did not want to shower with him. They did not want to dress with him. They did not want to play with him. And in some cases, he wasn't even allowed to practice on the same practice field as his white teammates. But when the coach saw Fritz Pollard's athletic ability, he saw opportunity to actually win some games. And the suspected white supremacist coach, I don't got his name, go and do your own research. You can find all those particulars out for yourself. That is not pertinent to the subject at hand. But the suspected white supremacist coach wound up allowing Fritz Pollard to play on the Brown University Ivy League college team, in which they were very competitive. They started to win games, and in particular, they beat Princeton and Yale, or Princeton and Harvard. I forget the two top colleges at that time, but they beat them. And Frederick Douglass Pollard, also known as Fritz Pollard, he wound up being an All-American. First All-American subject to black classification. As I understand it, I could be in error. Then they wound up being invited to the granddaddy of them all, as they call it in college, meaning the Rose Bowl. First African American to participate in the Rose Bowl, as I understand it. First person subject to black classification. I'm sorry for using the African American term. I know it can be extremely confusing for those of us who are less confused. Let's move on. And let's talk about the All-American Fritz Pollard. Fritz Pollard played quarterback, running back, split end, kicker, punter, defensive back, punt return, kick return. Yes, indeed. He was just as good as of an offensive player as he was a defensive player. On both sides, 5'6", 5'7", 150 pounds on a wet day. You understand me? He dominated both sides amongst giants. Football, primarily during these times, was a brute dominated sport, meaning they put the ball in the middle of the field. You had 3 downs to get 5 yards, and all they did was push, punch, eye gouge, scratch, pull limbs, do whatever they thought they could do to move the ball. Speed and agility was not anything that was introduced and or valued in the game of football until our ancestor Fritz Pollard came into the game and brought that razzle dazzle. You understand me? And again, yeah, I said he played quarterback, running back, split end, kicker, punter, defensive back, punt return, kick return, and he dominated in a brute-dominated sport. This is extremely impressive if any of you follow the discipline of football. Understanding the rules, you can only there was no passing at the time. Passing was something new, so passing wasn't as prevalent as it is today. Actually, passing was introduced, I believe, in 1908. I believe Fritz Pollard was in junior high, 6th, 7th grade. Passing was introduced because a lot of people was dying and being killed in the sport of football. They had to clean it up. I think in 1908, the president had to do a mandate. Y'all need to change the rules because too many of our young men are dying in college, high school athletics. It was that brutal. So imagine being subject to black classification in a toxic, anti-black, racist, white supremacist environment, being the smallest person wherever you went, amongst a bunch of mighty giants who classify themselves as white, in a sport where it is legal to step on people, punch people, clothes hang people, put knees into backs, cleats into faces, knock people teeth out, eye gouge. And this small frame individual by the name of Frederick Douglass Pollard dominated while people was out for his head. You could legally go and target and kill somebody in the sport of football, and nobody was able to get Frederick Douglass Pollard. He dominated. He was the #1 draw in the United States of America outside of Jim Thorpe. Y'all not hearing me. My question is this: how do we not know who Fritz Pollard is? Let me move on to the information. I'm getting off track. I apologize, family. After he left college, he went to coach Lincoln University. He played on some semi-pro teams. He played in professional teams, but professional football was not as it is today. Professional football was an under economy delicacy. It was a whole bunch of criminal element, shiesty, unhonorable things going on in football at the time. So a team will pop up here, the next year the team is gone. You'll have a league over here one year, the next year the league is gone. It was a whole bunch of shadiness, equivalent to what we can identify as the boxing game today. That's how football was in 1918, when our ancestor Fritz Pollard got out of college and wanted to go pro. Not only was it shiesty and shady activity going on in what was known as professional football, if you could call it that. I call it organized crime at that time. Not only was that going on, you had to deal with the element of anti-black, racist, suspected white supremacists owning and running leagues. It was so bad where people subject to black classification pretty much knew that they weren't going to be accepted on some of these teams unless the team was so sorry till the owner was like, oh my goodness, I might well get some of the Negroes on the team because I can't compete with the supreme white talent. And that's what was going on, family. That's how people subject to black classification wound up being allowed to play on some of these professional teams that were scattered all over the country. That being said, Fritz Pollard wound up playing for a team known as the Akron Pros. Fritz Pollard got on the team. He was a player coach. I believe he got on the team around 1919. He got on the team. They were extremely good. I believe that they dominated and were crowned the champs, if I'm not mistaken, the following year. Same old story, same old song. Fritz Pollard dominated, and they wind up winning the APFL championship, and the APFL eventually turned into the NFL. And we have a photo of Fritz Pollard in Canton, Ohio, in the Hall of Fame on the first NFL championship team, the only black on the team, the only star. It was his team. He was the coach, player, meaning he was the starting coach. He was he was the starting quarterback. He was the star punt return. He was the star kick return. He was the kicker. You understand me? He was the running back. He was the everything. He was the draw. He was put on the ticket to advertise the championship game, Fritz Pollard and the Akron Pros versus none other than Jim Thorpe and the Bulldogs. I forget the city that he was from, but Jim Thorpe was part of a team which mascot was the Bulldogs, and Fritz Pollard won. And you can go into Canton, Ohio. You can research this. Don't take my word for it. The only black, the smallest person on the team of the championship team, and it was because of him. Now, I am mentioning this because there's very little information that we do know about Fritz Pollard. I had to dig deep into the crevices of the net, and I had to actually purchase 2 or 3 books to get tidbits. And I would recommend, and this is for time's constraints, I can't tell you all the things, like who did he come from, who did he marry, who raised Fritz Pollard. Fritz Pollard was the youngest of 8 children, not the youngest, he was the second youngest, he was the 7th of 8 children, and his brothers and sisters were just as accomplished as him. His mother and father were 2 great human beings, you understand me. And in order to find out the totality of Fritz Pollard and his 6 degrees of separation from greatness all around him, Fritz Pollard was a contemporary and a friend to the late great Paul Robeson. And now if my information isn't correct, he actually hired Paul Robeson to play on his Harlem Brown Bombers team. Yes, Fritz Pollard was also a team owner. He tried to create a black league because the professional leagues were not hiring black athletes. So he said, okay, there's a problem. Let me provide the solution. Let's get our own league. He was the owner of 2 teams, one by which he hired Paul Robeson to play on the team, and he coached at a historically black university called Lincoln University. He coached that university, and he hired Paul Robeson as an assistant coach to fill in for him when he could not be available for, I believe, Saturday games, because he had to supplement his income because the coaching job was not paying a livable wage. So he coached, and then he also played professionally for the Akron Pros. Can't make this stuff up. Look this individual up. Frederick Douglass Pollard. You understand me? Playing past racism. And let me tell you some of the things that Fritz Pollard did in his lifetime. You understand? You already know that he played for Brown University. He was a college All-American. He was a quarterback, running back, split end, kicker, punter, defensive back, punt return, kick return. He was a coach. He was an owner of the Harlem Brown Bombers. He was an insurance salesman. He also wrote his own column. Yes, indeed. He wrote columns about professional football. And he was a journalist. And he owned his own black publication. He owned his own black news publication. Yes, he did. He was a track athlete. He was in particular a competitive track athlete, and if I'm not mistaken, he participated in the Olympics. He also was a baseball player, a basketball coach. He was a United States veteran, I believe by way of the Army. He also participated in the Ebony Film Corporation based out of Chicago. Yes, indeed. Listen. This dude was a Renaissance man. And when we talk about NFL, the American pastime of the National Football League, when they inducted honorary members to the Hall of Fame, meaning the founding fathers of the NFL, and you had George Halas, you had Art Rooney, you had, I forget the first name, but Marshall, the owner of the Washington Redskins, who was the last owner to hire somebody subject to black classification, I believe in the 1960s or early 70s. You can check me on that. Do your own research. Don't take my word for it. But what I'm saying is they inducted all the white supremacists. And the founder, the big ticket, the one who made the NFL popular, because he was the guy Pitt against NFL star Jim Thorpe in the championship game in 1920. They did not induct him into the NFL Hall of Fame until he was well passed away, I believe, in 1995. I forget. It was in the 1990s or late 80s when he was put into the Hall of Fame, not the honorary founders enshrinement. And that's embarrassing. Well, maybe it's not embarrassing, because I have concluded that we're in a global system of racism, white supremacy. And if indeed we are, that means that the system is working fine, is chugging, just like it's supposed to chug along. And I hope I have contributed to less confusion. And always remember, keep learning and stay codified.
And you're the prey.